Hello, my name is Mary. I'm in the Psych 451 class, and this is my presentation on Chapter 9, God and the Limbic System, a deeper look into religious experiences. So how do humans have religious experiences? Religion has been around for a long time in humanity and human existence, around for generations, and human brains have evolved to ask the questions of why are we here? What purpose do we have? Is there a higher power? Did someone put us here? And so for over the decades, we have cultivated ideas around what type of higher power that is, what type of being, and this has been shown in many different types of religions and spiritual practices. The limbic system is the part of the brain that is in charge of emotions, emotional expression. It guides future behavior in terms of emotions. The limbic system gets input from all sensory systems. The hypothalamus playing a big role in the expression of emotion, and it's kind of the brain of the limbic system. So in Chapter 9, Ramachandran talks about a doctor that called him and told him that he had stimulated his temporal lobes and experienced God for the first time. So the question is, do our temporal lobes in our brain, are they responsible for religious experiences and believing in God? Ramachandran also talks about temporal lobe epilepsy. Epilepsy has been an interesting symptom that was not understood for the longest time, and when someone had epilepsy, historically people thought that they were having a religious experience or they were experiencing God, and they couldn't figure out why this person would fall down on the ground and shake for a little while and act like they're dead, and then 5 minutes later pop up and be fine again. So that a lot of that was attributed to due to lack of understanding a religious experience with God. Now that we have had technology and I've been understanding more things about the brain, we understand now that it's actually a misfire of neurons that creates these epileptic symptoms. In terms of temporal lobe epilepsy, however, these type of seizures don't occur as normal as other seizures do, such as grand mal seizures, which is a motor response. Temporal lobe epilepsy occurs with focal seizures, which are located in a specific area of the brain. And in terms of the limbic system, it is the outward expression of this is emotional. And so I found a study with temporal lobe epilepsy, and they did 3 different groups: those who had temporal lobe epilepsy with something called the Gestalt-Geschwind syndrome, which is basically temporal lobe personality, which exhibits symptoms of hyperreligiosity, hypergraphia, hyposexuality, and irritability. And they had a group of the hyperreligious epileptics, and then a group with a temporal lobe epilepsy who did not exhibit signs of this syndrome, and just a non-epileptic group who proclaimed to be part of a religious group. And what they found was that the previous research on temporal lobe epilepsy was correct in terms of those who had the syndrome, that they displayed higher levels of hyperreligiosity and hypergraphia. But what was interesting was that those people who displayed these symptoms had more experiences or reported more experiences of postictal psychosis, which is an episode of psychosis occurring after a cluster of seizures, which includes a range of psychotic symptoms, including hallucinations, disorders of thought, and can last anywhere up to minutes to months. And so what was interesting about this study was that those people exhibited, if they had these postictal psychosis experiences, they were more prone to develop the Gestalt-Geschwind syndrome. And also what was interesting in terms of this study was that some patients in this study had a temporal lobectomies done on them due to getting rid of the seizures, and they reported that they did not have a change in religiosity after the lobectomy. And that was a question that Ramachandran brought up in his book, was, if we had if we did a temporal lobectomy, would we preferably, perform a godectomy so the person wouldn't experience religion after that? Well, it's not necessarily true. So that shows that there are other areas of the brain that are influential and play a part in religion. Another study I found was a study involving patients suffering from traumatic brain injuries and lesions in the brain. These lesions were to the frontal and temporal regions, and they were correlated with greater mystical experiences. And they're specifically areas in the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. And this study talked about two different hypotheses: a temporal involvement hypothesis, which is mystical experiences are induced by activity in regions in the brain associated with emotion, abstract semantics, and imagery, which we were talking about in that temporal lobe area. And then the executive inhibition hypothesis is another hypothesis, talking about executive downregulation in response to authoritative suggestions underpins mystical experiences, specifically to the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. And downregulation is talking about the number of receptors for a neurotransmitter are decreased, and they typically in response to an increase in the release of that neurotransmitter. But also downregulation can also refer to generally to the decreasing of any cellular component, such as protein or RNA. But this study suggests that the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex plays a big role in the regulation of mystical processes, they hypothesized that perhaps this diminished executive functioning may be associated with the acceptance of religious experiences. And then in this study, it also talked about recent studies show memory of mystical experiences to be associated with the right temporal lobe regions instead of the left. So that right temporal lobe has more of a chance of remembering these religious experiences and being activated to them. And then finally, while the temporal lobe generates the mystical experience, the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex plays a big role in the interpretation of that experience. Like, what does it mean? Is it real? And whatnot. And so that's what I found in terms of further research on temporal lobe epilepsy and whether or not religion is just primarily associated with the temporal lobes, which in a lot of ways it is, but it also has other areas of the brain that are associated with it. And here's my list of references. You're welcome to do further research on this. Thanks so much for watching, and if you have any questions, I'll be available during class. Thanks so much.